Welcome back to the Writers Craft Summit. In this session, I'm speaking with author Derek Murphy. Derek, welcome to the summit.
Hi, it's exciting to be here. I'm really happy to be talking about craft as opposed to like the book design and marketing stuff like usual.
Yeah, I mean, you are someone that's interesting because you came out of the world of design and into the world of being an author. And so you probably have a pretty unique perspective in that. I think a lot of people start as writers and then have to learn the marketing side of things, whereas you kind of came out of that world of understanding design and understanding marketing. And
Yeah, but
then
only by necessity because I had wanted to be an author and I failed really badly. So I had to learn, book design or marketing or online stuff just to support myself because the writing wasn't working. And since then, now that I've learned business and publishing, I've gone back to the writing, which is kind of my true love. So I'm excited that like I have these skills. I can still help a lot of authors by teaching these skills, but I'm also just working like on my art again, like on my own projects, my fiction especially, which I think is a lot more rewarding.
And when Derek talks about, yeah, he was a cover designer, but his love has always been writing. He actually has a PhD in literature. So when you say you've always loved story and always loved fiction and writing, you're not kidding. This is something you've studied intimately and intensely for many decades.
Yeah, my PhD, it's kind of funny in graduate school because your bachelor's, you read all the books, and then your master's and your PhD, you read all this philosophy and psychology, and then you just try to apply those philosophical systems to a certain book. So you're like interpreting the literature from a certain viewpoint. So I did mine on Paradise Lost. It was kind of like a psychoanalysis of the process that the characters go through in Paradise Lost, which now I'm writing dark fantasy. There's a lot of things I use from Paradise Lost. And the cool thing is Paradise Lost is such an influential piece of literature. It's such a kind of foundational shift in the history of Western literature. And a lot of the famous best-selling literary works of the last, 4 or 5 centuries refer to Paradise Lost. If you know what to look for, they're quoting it or they're referring to it, and you can trace this massive lineage that started from that book. So I think it helps me not only to appreciate literature, but also when I'm writing fiction, I can kind of see, I basically try to boil it down. And I had to do this actually for my own writing. Like I read a whole bunch of guides on writing and I still couldn't do it myself. So I had to because everybody says different things and there's all these different systems to follow. So I had to boil it down to like something that worked for me. I did a 9-point plot outline, and then I recently did like a 24 or 25 chapter outline that I now start with. So when I'm writing fiction, I just start with that because I know as long as I hit those points, it's going to be a pretty good book. And I still leave a lot of it open, and I'm actually trying to train myself to be more of a pantser because I think the pantsers have an advantage. Not only do they write faster, but they tend to write more like immediate, more emotional character conflict. They do a lot of that naturally, whereas sometimes if you get too bogged down in the plot and the mechanics, like I know my plot is really good, but that doesn't necessarily mean readers are going to stick with it unless you're building in the tension and the conflict and suspense, which I think some people just do naturally. I think if you're not successful with your writing, or if you get stuck, which is what happened to me, it helps to have a plot because then you know where you're going. So I always recommend to everybody that plotting is a really good idea. Personally, I think it's a really good idea, but I also think once you get really good at writing and once you've done a few books with plot, you can start to kind of get away from that structure and do things a little bit differently.
Yeah, I mean, everyone loves to quote Stephen King on writing, saying that he doesn't plot. But I think what you've just said is what's going on there, right? He just understands story so intimately that this stuff is just so intuitive to him that he feels like he's like, oh, I'm just making it up as I go along. But yeah, you're making it up as you go along because story is like flowing through the blood in your veins.
And Stephen King's such a funny example because he can't end books well. He builds the intrigue really well because people are like, what is going on? And there's a lot of conflict between the characters. The characters are like, what is happening? But because he doesn't start with a really good plot, almost all of his books just kind of fizzle out at the end. None of them make sense. None of it's like, oh, this is why all those things happen. It just kind of like ends. And that's okay because you've already read the whole thing, and he hooks you with the story and the scenes and the characters. It's a different kind of writing, and I think like I have friends who are pantsers who I feel like have the same problem. They don't really like their books don't actually go anywhere, but they're still great because the suspense and intrigue is like it just pulls you in. And they paint the pictures, you love the characters. It doesn't really matter if it all makes sense at the end, because most readers aren't going to go back and be like, well, what about this thing, the open loop in chapter 3 that you never explained. Most readers aren't going to notice that stuff anyway. I tend to notice that, so I want my books to be really tightly plotted. I think that's one of my advantages, but I also know that that's not necessarily like the most important feature of fiction writing. So while it helps me, I think readers don't necessarily care. So I'm trying to kind of learn a bit of both.
So you touched on earlier this idea of suspense and of tension and of how we build these things. It actually, I think it ties nicely into that academic conversation as well, because as you said, once you're at the graduate level, it's no longer just about looking at the text, but like applying a philosophy to the text. So my master's, I was using some Derrida and some deconstruction theory and applying it to a Daredevil comic book. And one of the things that we talk about in deconstruction, right, is this idea of not just what's there, but what's absent, what's missing. And I think that ties really nicely into this idea of suspense and tension, of knowing when to give the reader something and when to withhold something. So I know you've done some videos and some thinking on this topic lately. So let me know where are you at in terms of how do we build suspense?
Okay. What I've found, and I do this also when I was doing editing, or I'm working with some writers right now, and we're trying to kind of co-write stories. And what I generally find is there's all this backstory information, and it's tricky to learn when to put it in. But the main mistakes I think writers make is that they have too much conversation. So whenever there's any scene where the two characters are sitting down and just talking about this stuff, that's a suspense killer. It's an intrigue killer. So you never want an uninterrupted conversation. You always want your characters to kind of, like, they should be asking the questions, because if there's weird stuff going on, they shouldn't just keep responding. Whenever there's kind of the slow scenes, that's kind of the response scenes, and then the action scenes where they just have to, not get killed basically. And it's going back and forth. So in the slow scenes, you want them to be like, what just happened? Ask all the questions. I have to find the answers to these things, but you don't want them to actually get the answers. And so if there's a conversation where they're sitting with the person who has the answers, that conversation can't finish, because if they all just lay their cards out on the table, there's no more tension, or intrigue or suspense. Eventually, like at the end of the book, at the debrief, basically, after you have the hero at the mercy of the villain scene where the villain is confessing all the backstory stuff, you want to have that happen. And then afterwards, you probably want like one final scene where the hero is with the mentor, the Dumbledore, whoever, or even the other teammates, and they're just kind of like finally actually talking through all the stuff and filling in the plot holes or the gaps. But until then, you don't want them to have a full conversation about that, because then you've told it all, you've given it away. If readers know exactly why things are happening, there's no more suspense or intrigue. And if they know why it's happening, they don't have to keep reading the book to figure it out. You want the weird things to keep happening, and you want the characters to be asking the questions, but you don't want to give them the answers. You also want to be careful not to have the characters guess the right answer. If the character's like, oh, I wonder if, this is the main reveal. I wonder if this is who the real bad guy is. If the character guesses all of the right stuff, then the reader already knows. You want the character to kind of guess the wrong stuff and plant the clues, but you don't want to give it all away. And sometimes what you have to do is interrupt conversations. So they start asking the questions, and they maybe start giving a couple of the answers so that they have a plan of action. Like, you give them enough pieces of information to be like, well, we're going to have to go talk to this guy to find the clue. We're going to have to go find that book in the library. You give them like enough information to take action on the next piece of the puzzle, but then you limit it and you hold it back. So maybe that's because somebody doesn't want to tell them the answers, or because, you know, there's an explosion or the bad guys come or something happens that disrupts the conversation, especially when there's any kind of a romantic twist. Whenever there's two characters who, it can be romance, like two characters who like each other, but they just can't really get their shit together, or antagonists. So you usually have like the mean girl or the bully, or maybe like eventually in later on in the series, they're going to become allies. But right now, they don't like each other. If they ever sit down and have a conversation, there's a video on YouTube that's something like how to deal with bullies. And basically all it is, you know, the teacher has a student say a bunch of mean stuff about him, and he's dealing with like, how do you disarm that meanness? How do you disarm that tension? And it's basically just like being nice and friendly and being like, why are you acting this way? Why are you angry? What can I do to help? If you have your characters sit down and talk to each other, all of that tension disappears. So especially when you're building fake tension, you know, like the allies are fighting, or the romantic leads are fighting, or the antagonists, you know, there has been misunderstanding where they don't trust each other, they don't like each other, but that tension and that intrigue would just be dead if they actually sat down for 5 minutes to talk to each other. So you want to try to make sure they don't have those conversations, even if they kind of want to, even if they feel bad. You have to make sure that they just never sit down and talk through their shit, because then there's no more tension. You have to keep building the tension and the conflict until you get to the end of the book and they can finally put their cards down on the table and figure all that stuff out.
I think that's such a good point, the relationship between dialogue and tension, because that's one of the problems we see a lot in beginner writers. Dialogue is just, everything is so on the nose. Everyone is just saying exactly what they think and exactly what's going on. And I think you're hitting the nail on the head there when you say, you know, in real life, we never actually, you know, when in real life, if a bully walked up to you and started bullying you, you're probably not going to be like, why do you feel this way, right? Like we react and we speak, you know, emotionally and not always logically, and we don't always get to the point of things. And so that's so true. Also, this idea of kind of like this, like discussing what's going on, reminds me of the X-Files, because I was a huge X-Files fan, and there's all these complaints that was always like, can we just get the truth already? And I was like, no, the show is about the search for the truth. The story is about the adventure. It's not about finding it. Like if Mulder and Scully just sat down and said, oh, here's the truth, we wouldn't have a show. There'd be no drama. There'd be no tension.
And also, one of the ways you can do that is just to add the danger or the intrigue, because if there's no risk, if there's no fear, if there's no danger, then they would just sit down and have a conversation. But you have to add some level of, somebody is trying to kill me. I don't know who it is. Can I trust this person? I don't know what's really going on. Like, even in normal life, most people don't sit down and talk about their feelings. Most people don't sit down and talk about their backstory, their childhood trauma, and all of that stuff might be important to your story eventually, but it doesn't happen right away. Characters won't open up to each other until they've had a lot of time together where they haven't been open with each other. So there's a lot of frustration, misunderstanding. Almost always you see this in romance where like the main character finally figures out what they want and what they have to do to get it, and they run over to their love interest's house to confess their feelings, but then they see the love interest with another woman who they guess is like another partner or romantic relationship. Actually, it's probably his sister or somebody else, but just when they're ready to like sit down, have the conversation and confess everything, then you throw a wrench in the works, right when it's painful, right when the character like opens up and is ready to share. That's when you kind of make it even more difficult by throwing something else in there. But as long as there's a lot of danger and conflict and tension, then they're going to be careful. They're going to be careful about who they talk to, about what. not only because, you know, these are deep, traumatic, personal issues that they don't want to share, but also because there are real consequences. There are dangers out there, and they don't know who they can trust. Those are also ways you can kind of like push the reveals out. I think there's a hard problem for most first-time writers because they have all this backstory, which they've probably written like a Bible for their book. And it's important to put the backstory in somewhere. It can be difficult to know when to put it in, but you just got to make sure that, like, you have to know what the backstory is, but you have to put it in pieces. You can't just have like a full-out dump of everything. You have to have like hints and small messages, like something bad happened before, but you wait until the end before you finally have those big reveals.
What about the relationship between sharing information with the reader that the character doesn't have? We see this in horror a lot, right? Most of the tension in a horror film comes from the fact that the viewer knows the monster's in the room, but the girl walking down the hallway towards the room doesn't know it. Do you see that same technique playing out in fiction writing?
Yes, but I don't think I'm great at that. I write all my books in first person, so my readers see what the characters see. So I'll include hints where the character will find something, and people could start piecing it together. I don't think my plots are pretty easy to figure out. So one of the nice things about my reviews is that they say, you know, I didn't see the ending coming, which is really good for me. That's something I'm proud of because I can tell a story without giving it away too early. I think that's something I've really worked on. Something I'm not sure that's quite related that I want to touch on was 3 types of conflict. So when I'm doing scenes, because I do first person, so you only really see what the first person is dealing with, what the main protagonist is dealing with. I'll have 3 kinds of conflict, which is the internal, my character is nervous about something, she's thinking about something, the fears and the wants. Usually it's like what she wants versus what she has to do, but it's kind of the interior monologue stuff. Then there's the external conflict, like things are actually happening. Like there's a storm, there's a car crash, the bad guys are attacking. And then the third piece is other characters that are on her team. So not necessarily the antagonist forces, but her other allies, her friends even, the gang, the circle of heroes, they don't always agree on stuff. They may sabotage each other because they want different things, which I call like a side conflict. I don't think I have a really good name for that third type of conflict. But so even if readers don't know what's happening, or even if the protagonist can't see what's happening on a larger scale, there's enough conflict going on in the novel. There's always, in every scene, I think there should be the 3 types of conflict, but at least you can get one. Because if you ever have a scene where there's no conflict, it doesn't belong in your book. If there's no conflict, there's no story. There has to be tension, there has to be stakes. So you kind of have to keep reminding readers what's at stake, why this matters, why is this dangerous, why does the reader care? This has come up a couple of times in the stuff that I've edited, where the main character is just really passionate about something, so they get involved, like they have this mission, they get involved to go out and do something, but they never really explain why the character cares so much about that thing. They need some backstory or motivation. It has to really matter to them on a deep existential level, or they wouldn't do it. And that should be a really big level. It shouldn't be like, I want to, help this other person. It should be like, I want to save my life or the life of my family or my love interest or save the world. Like it has to be pretty big stakes. So you kind of have to, like, even if there's little things happening, every couple chapters you have to be like, if I don't do this, the world's going to end. If I don't do this, my brother's going to die. Like you have to kind of keep reminding them why they need to do anything. Because if they don't need to do anything, the main character just will stay home and watch Netflix like the rest of us do. Like you have to make it matter enough for the main characters to take action. And that kind of has to be reinforced. So I don't think I answered your question, mostly because I don't think I deal with that as much in my novels.
No, I think that's a great point, though. We have another session all about point of view, and that's just an example of how the choices and point of view that you make impact the other techniques and things that you can use. And so, while someone writing in third person or omniscient can really provide the reader, I always use the bomb under the desk example, right? Like if you just tell the reader, "Oh, there's a bomb under the protagonist's desk that the protagonist doesn't know about," boom, suddenly we have tension, right? Whereas when you're writing first person, you don't have that option, but then you do play on other things like surprise. Oh, a bomb suddenly blows up. We had no idea it was coming. So it's a completely different effect, but it's related to the point of view that you've chosen.
Usually I used to do prologues so I could, because I do slow burn young adult fantasy novels where it takes a while for the main protagonist to figure out what's going on. It's a lot of mystery and suspense. But I wanted to make sure I get their attention, so I'd kill someone at the beginning or show something of the antagonist at the beginning. I don't think I'll keep doing that. It's a device, it works to some extent, but then you're like starting a story somewhere else, and then like 10 years later, you start with the present story. That's not the greatest way to write fiction. It kind of works if you have a slower build to your story. What I've seen work a lot better in young adult more recently, more with like urban fantasy, is just more kick-ass protagonists that just like they start badass. They start mid-story where they already have this badass history. They already have all these skills. They're already really tough and cool. My protagonists tend to like be fearful and afraid, and they grow into strength over the series. But while I like my books a lot and readers like them, they're not as compelling. They're not as like action based as the stuff that really sells. And I would like to sell more books, so I will start experimenting with books that kind of start a little faster.
Great. That's something interesting too about you is you're very aware of what's going on out there in the marketplace, and you take a look at what readers are really interested in, and then you try to replicate that.
I still am doing, like when I started writing young adult fiction, I was doing like the Twilight model. So the Twilight model, my books are kind of like that. It's a new girl in a new place, learning about the new world. There's some weird supernatural stuff going on, and then she becomes important to the plot. And I like that. I like my books. I have some really long fantasy books that people really like, so I'm happy that I can write those books. But if I want to write books that, I think selling well is important. I think maybe I'm happy with those books that I've written, but I also want to get more people in my reader funnels so that more people will read those other books that I've written. So I want to also be writing some really popular stuff that's a little bit easier to sell, and also just that connects with a different audience. So maybe once they've read those books that are more what they want, I can say, I also have this other book. It's a little bit slower, but I really think you'll like it. Once I've earned their trust with the stuff that's a little bit more on market, then I can kind of lead them to some other stuff that's more what I enjoy writing.
And I think that's a great example of why I think this summit is important. I mean, you're someone, you have a PhD in literature, you've been in the book world for, over a decade, right? Like working in indie publishing and everything. You've written all these books now, but you're still so interested in the craft and in developing and in trying new techniques and in understanding models and frameworks and how those things interact with spontaneity and with the whole pantsing side of things that you were talking about.
The funny thing about craft, and it's one of the weirdest things that I see a lot in the industry, is that people who write fast or people who write to market, they're generally better at the craft. And that's not what most people think. Most authors think, if I want to focus on the craft, I'm not going to think about the market. I'm not going to think about book sales or what's popular or what people are buying. I'm just going to do my own thing. But craft isn't the same as inspiration. It's not something that you just find your way into. You can experiment and somewhat good at writing, but it would be so much faster to just read a couple books on plotting, on dialogue, on tension. You can learn this stuff. There are books out there, there are resources, and you can learn it really quickly. You can learn it before you write your first book, and you can write a good book on purpose without spending years and years writing bad books, which is what most authors do. They spend years writing bad books, and then eventually they're like, okay, nobody likes my books. Nobody wants to pay for my books. I thought that was the way to write good books, but it really isn't. The way to write good books is to know who your audience is and what they enjoy and what other books are selling really well, and reading those things, because you can reverse engineer it. It doesn't mean it's less enjoyable to write, and it definitely doesn't mean it's less good quality, because I think number one, the definition of good quality is whether other people like it, but also I think good quality doesn't mean, given by inspiration that you wrote in a cave. What a lot of writers think is that the more you're passionate about it, the more you feel inspired, the better it is, the better objective, high quality it is. And that's not true. But also, I had another point I was going to say. I think I lost it. Something about, the reason that it feels good to write books without a plot or to write books without the market. I read this quote in a book somewhere that I don't have on me, but maybe I'll write a blog post or something about it we can link to. But it was something like, there are two methods of being creative. And the one way is to reverse engineer the process, to have a formula and to map it out and to sit down and do the work. The other way is just to make it up as you go along. And the second way, the one where you just make it all up, it's more rewarding because it feels like, because you don't know what's going to happen next. It's this discovery process where you feel like, wow, the universe is filling my brain with these unexpected pieces of creative genius. It feels more rewarding. It feels like something supernatural is happening, which is why writers get really excited about it. They're like, this is the most amazing thing ever. It must be the universe channeling genius through me because I don't know how it's happening. You're like, when you start doing something, your brain will fill in the gap, feel miraculous, which is why it gets writers so excited. But that doesn't mean you're writing something good. It doesn't mean you're writing something that readers are actually going to like. And that's a problem most writers make, because they think, I'm going to do it this miraculous way that feels good to me because it must be the right way. But actually, it doesn't mean you're going to put out a good quality book, which means you're going to create something that you love, and then you're going to waste all your money and time on marketing it, and it's never going to perform well because it's just not a good book. Anyway, I think it's an important point to make that I don't think most writers get, because they still feel like somehow it's selling out. Like if you do a formula, if you figure out plotting, if you think about your market or your audience, then it must be like you're lowering yourself, you're lowering your abilities, and you're not doing this creative genius miracle stuff. You're just doing this like fill in the numbers. Anyway, it feels different. It feels like it can feel less satisfying, but only because of the mindset. If you shift your mindset and you think writing good books means writing books that readers enjoy, then you don't have that problem. It doesn't feel less satisfying to write good books that readers enjoy. It's actually a lot cooler because I can finish a book. I know that my readers will like it. I know that it will sell. I know that I'm not wasting my time writing these books. And of course I still enjoy it because I'm still just as creative, but I have arguments all the time with people who say, I'm selling out. I'm just a hack. I'm not a real artist or a real creative writer or a real author, because I know what I'm doing, and because I'm not just, writing into the void and letting the universe fill in the blanks. Anyway, it's a source of controversy, but I also think that's the main reason 90% of authors fail, is just because they're not at the point where they've made the mind shift yet to start writing books that readers like on purpose.
I love it. I think that's a nice summation of one of my goals with this entire summit, right? It's just get the information out there so that people have the tools, so that, they're on the path to success. And like, I think it was Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, right? In the context of boxing. And that's how it is with writing as well. Like, yeah, you do the outline, you create the character sketches, you do all the craft stuff. But then when you get in there and start writing it, it's like getting punched in the face, and you're finding out, you're adjusting, and you're reacting anyway. So it always is spontaneous to some extent anyway. So you might as well set yourself up for success.
Yeah.
Well, Derek, thank you so much for coming on. Is there any final thoughts you wanted to share, particularly on this topic of creating tension and conflict and mystery and intrigue in our stories?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay, great. Well, I think we had you touched on some great points here. If people want to find you, learn more about your books and the support that you offer to authors, where should we send them?
CreativeIndie.com is my main hub and site. It's kind of a personal blog. I talk about all sorts of different things, but that's where I put links to everything.
Fantastic. Well, Derek, I know you're on the other side of the world from me right now, and we had some technical difficulties even making this happen. So I really appreciate you, getting through the technical struggles and making the time to join me on the Writers Craft Summit today.
Yeah, Bali is wonderful, but it's also just a little challenging with basic infrastructure stuff like reliable internet. It's kind of funny that way. But it's been a lot of fun. I love talking about craft and writing fiction especially, so thanks for having me on.